Hey folks, so I'm back with round 5 of my recent tournament, the Bay Area International. So after 3 straight losses, I was paired with Anaiy Somalwar. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing his name right, but actually I'm familiar with him. He's a local junior in the Bay Area. I've even played him once before. So yeah, it's kind of a tough spot when you're having a tough tournament and you're just relegated like all the way to the back of the room with like the bottom few boards, but I just had to try to fight my way out of there. Okay, so this game went knight f3, d5. I was playing white. I played e3. And similar to my game against Kaufman, I wanted to try out kind of a new approach here with e3 and c4. And, well, try to take the game out of theoretical territory and more into just a positional struggle right from the early stages of the game. So Anaiy, he is mostly Queen's Gambit decline player, so he kind of sticks to his setup here with d5 and e6. I went for b3, bishop e7, bishop e2, castles, and knight c3. So recently, Karyakin and Mamanjarov have been playing this setup a lot. And it's quite interesting. It looks fairly playable for white. I think it's a nice tool to use when you just want to get a game, but still put pressure on your opponent without having to memorize tons of theory. So here black played b6, and my understanding is usually when black plays b6, it's time for white to take on d5, because if black hadn't played b6, then black's choice would be easy. They would just play e takes d5, and then the bishop can come out naturally to g4 or f5 or whatever. But after b6, ed5 is still the move black wants to play, and this is the move played in the game. But now the bishop is somewhat committed to b7, and it's not going to be super active shooting against the d5 pawn. Black could also take with the knight here and leave the diagonal open, but after knight takes d5, queen takes d5, and let's say queen c2, I think white is probably slightly better here. I now have an extra center pawn which I might use, and I have ideas of like bishop d3 hitting the h7 pawn and threatening things like bishop e4 as well. So I think white has a slight edge there. And so black played e takes d5. This is probably the most solid move. I played d4, c5, and now white has a choice to make. I ended up going with bishop e2. I really wanted to put my bishop on d3 as well, but I just felt like on e2 I'm not blocking my queen. So after knight c6, which was actually played in the game, black is not really threatening to take on d4 because I can always recapture with a piece. So first I'll take with the knight, then if the knight takes again, I'll take with the queen, and I'm leaving black with this isolated queen pawn on d5. So if I had played bishop d3, I don't really have the same luxury. If black plays knight c6 and let's say castles, black can take on d4. I'm forced to take back with the pawn, and black can do something like bishop g4 and is completely fine. So I felt like bishop e2 was probably the right square for the bishop. And now he did surprise me with knight c6. I felt like here actually this is a little bit dubious. Instead, black should probably just play bishop b7, just putting the bishop on this square, white probably castles, and knight bd7. And the point, I think, the reason the knight is better here is that if white ever takes on c5, which we often do in this position, black can take back with the pawn, and with the hanging pawn structure, I think the knight is definitely better placed on d7, as it can actually defend the c5 pawn. In the game, we'll see that knight was on c6, and black had problems with the c5 pawn and the c5 square, and white is able to put a lot of pressure. Well, okay, so knight c6 was played. Castles, bishop b7, rook c1. I could also just take on c5 right away, but I decided just to start with rook c1 and see where black is going to play from here. So if black takes on d4, then I get to leave him with this isolated queen pawn, and after something like this, I think white just has a really nice position. I can put pressure with bishop f3, rook d1. All my pieces already stand kind of beautifully, and this is a really nice version of this type of structure. So instead, black keeps the tension with rook to c8, and here I figured, okay, it's finally time to take on c5. So this is a common idea in this type of middle game. White takes on c5 and forces black to make a decision, either recapture with the bishop and get this IQP, or take with the b pawn and get these hanging pawns. So my opponent decided to take bc, which I think looks natural, but it is probably another kind of slight inaccuracy. Bishop takes c5 is probably more solid here. Then I would most likely play knight to b5, and I think white can count on a small advantage here, as I can put my knights on the d4 square, eventually put the bishop on f3, and I don't think black is getting quite enough activity as they would normally like to do when having the IQP here. In any case, b takes c5 was played, and I just went knight a4. And yeah, this looks very nice for white. Just the c5 pawn is hit, and it's not that easy to defend for black. So he went with the most natural move, knight to e4. And at first glance, it looks like black is perfectly active and everything is totally fine. The c5 pawn is defended, and black even has this idea to play knight b4 in the position. But after knight d2, black just all of a sudden has very clear problems defending the two pawns. I simply want to take on e4 and then eventually take on c5. And if knight takes d2, queen takes d2, well, black has to defend the pawn. I think something like knight b4 makes sense. And in the game, I was probably just going to play a3, knight a6, and probably bishop f3 here, and then rook fd1, and just ask black how he's going to defend the d5 pawn. And from afar, this position definitely looked like very unpleasant for black to defend, because the knight on a6 is bad. Both bishops are kind of passively defending the pawns, and white's pieces just look very, very nice and active, and I have a lot of ideas and queen c3 stuff in the position as well. Then checking the game with the engine, it pointed out actually a very interesting tactic. Apparently in this position, instead of pushing a3, white could just take on c5. And the point is, after bishop takes c5, rook takes c5, rook takes c5. I don't take on b4, then white would end up down in exchange, but I have queen d4, and I'm actually winning all the material back. But the line continues. I mean, everything really goes off the board. Queen takes rook, queen takes b2, queen takes b4, queen takes bishop, queen takes bishop. Black finally takes the pawn on a2 and even restores material equality. White plays something like g3, and well, Stockfish thinks white is a lot better here. It's probably the case. This d5 pawn is still really weak, and white can just easily try and round it up, but such limited material, it's not clear how great white's winning chances here are. In any case, I thought that line was quite interesting. So yeah, this was the game position, knight d2, and all of a sudden, black is just under huge pressure here. He decided to go with knight b4, which I don't think was the best reaction. I think he should have traded on d2 first, but I just played a3. Now it's very important that knight a2, I can play rook a1, and there's no knight c3 ideas. So black is forced to go back with knight a6, and here white can take on e4 and make black's structure even worse. Because now after d takes c4, the c5 pawn, the a7 pawn, these pawns are become isolated, and the e4 pawn is also now kind of hard to defend, because if black ever plays f5 in this position, it's definitely going to be weakening a lot of light squares. So I played queen c2 here. I also considered going into the endgame, but I figured there's no reason not to keep queens on, at least for now, since I can put a lot of pressure on his position. And I think I felt quite nice here. I mean, it's like white just has a very stable positional advantage. Okay, so black played knight b8. I think it makes sense. He's trying to redeploy the knight to maybe d7, where it would be better placed. And I think I found a very interesting move here, bishop b5. So I'm kind of preventing knight d7 because black will have to reckon with rook d1, and this is just extremely annoying. And after black plays a6, which happened in the game, bishop c4, I just pull back my bishop, but now two things. One, I have another target for my pieces, so I can put pressure on the pawn, and it's hard for black to move the knight without hanging this one. And secondly, my knight gets to use the b6 square, which might end up quite useful in a lot of positions. So I was quite happy with this change. Black decides to play queen c7. I played queen e2 and queen c6, rook d1, rook fd8. So here I felt was kind of a critical moment. I really spent a lot of time here trying to figure out how to proceed from here. I ended up going with queen h5, which more or less forces an endgame because black has to play queen g6, and then the idea was to trade queens and play this position. And I think white gets some serious winning chances here, so I don't think this was a bad decision. I could have also played a move like knight c3, which, to be honest, I didn't consider in the game too seriously, although I felt like it might be a nice option. And I think I just wanted to keep my knight on a4 for as long as possible. I wanted to keep the pressure on c5 so that I can even, in some positions, maybe even break with b4, and keep these ideas of putting the knight on b6 alive in the air as well. So I intuitively didn't feel like knight c3 was smart to bring the knight back. But yeah, I can put it on d5, and I think white's advantage probably gets bigger as the knight on d5 will be really strong. Well, in any case, I played queen h5, queen g6, trade, and g3. I think this is a pretty simple and safe move. I'm just creating, back rank left, and potentially I might entertain ideas of pulling the bishop back and putting it on g2. Well, black plays rook takes d1, and bishop c6. And here's where I kind of missed the moment to really fight for a big advantage. I really wanted to play a knight b6 here, and I considered this for a while, and I felt like the principled line here was going to be rook to d8, and then I take on d8, bishop takes d8, and I'm not sure if I considered this move knight c8 or not, but in any case, I definitely didn't feel like white was going to have such a big advantage here, and that black might have nice drawing chances, but I think this was just the wrong evaluation. I mean, the pawns on a6 and c5 are still really weak, especially this a6 pawn is just such a pain for black to defend, as the knight has to stay on b8, but white has ideas of playing bishop e5 and just hitting the knight and probably winning the pawn. So I feel like I definitely underappreciated how good this endgame was for white, because I ended up just playing simple move king to g2, just trying to like calmly improve my position. But I mean, usually this is the right thing to do, but here I think black just starts improving his position a little bit more and is able to slowly create counterplay. Okay, so he plays bishop b5. Now it's actually, I mean, an interesting moment. If I take on b5 and play knight to c3, I think his idea was probably to play bishop f6, and it turns out white has this move knight to d5, which keeps at least some advantage. Black can take on b2 because knight e7 check, and white wins the exchange. So bishop d8 would be forced, and then the computer finds this very sneaky move bishop a1, trying to play knight c3 back and hit both pawns, where bishop f6 will no longer be creating a pin, and then white can just take one of the pawns quite safely. So I guess this was a possibility in the game. I went for rook to c1, but I think the best chance was again knight b6, which I considered here again, but somehow didn't realize how good it was. So after rook to d8, what white should do is take, and the main point here is not to just move the knight, because then black could trade light squared bishops and is probably okay, but this key move a4, which I actually saw during the game but kind of underestimated. So if black takes the knight, then I'm going to take on b5, and I have the two bishops here in just a very nice position. Let's say takes. For one, his knight is just actually dominated here, and I'm threatening to put a lot of pressure on it. But secondly, the f3 pawn is quite weak, the e4 pawn is quite weak, and I can try to put pressure on this as well. And so it's just a great version of like the two bishops endgame. What I was more concerned about is if black trades bishops, then I have to take knight takes c4, and I just wasn't sure how good this endgame is for white. I definitely felt like white is better, but now the a6 pawn is no longer such an easy target for me, and with like reduced material, it just feels like I'm just not sure how big white's chances are. It turns out white probably has very, very close to winning endgame here. So if we reach this position in the game, hopefully I would have found the right way to proceed from here. The point is, after something like knight d7, is to just play f3 and get in with the king as quickly as possible. This is definitely something I didn't look far enough to really consider during the game. So if black takes, king takes, White's plan is to just run in on the light squares, and if the king is able to reach b7, then I'm going to win the a-pawn, and my a-pawn will become extremely strong. So it turns out to be a decisive edge. I analyzed for a while here, like let's say black plays f5, and Stockfish recommends trading knights, going into this kind of bishop endgame where I'm putting long-term pressure on the g7 pawn. Black always has to kind of worry about this one, and the c5 pawn as well is a constant weakness. And I believe White's winning plan here is to just play e4, g4, force black to trade his pawn on f5 off for one of mine, and then my king tries to get in, and eventually the more active king kind of decides the endgame. It's a really interesting position. I'd encourage you guys, if you're curious, to put it in ChessBase or some analysis board and take a look deeper for yourselves. Well, in any case, I guess I didn't evaluate that one well enough, so I decided to play rook c1. My mindset after 3 losses was to just try and play like super solid Russian school of chess, like always just calm, improving moves, not trying to force anything unless I'm really sure, and just trying to keep the advantage stable. But it wasn't the right strategy in this case, because black is able to, again, improve his position more than I can really improve mine. So he plays knight d7. Finally, the knight gets out. I decided to play h4 because I felt like this was another small improvement move I can make on the king side. And then a nice move from black, rook to b8. And all of a sudden, he's creating counterplay. He's starting to immediately take on a4, and if I recapture, my bishop on b2 is hanging. And if my knight moves, then he can take on c4, and my bishop on b2 will again be hanging. So white doesn't have a whole lot of choices here. I could make a move like bishop c3, and here I think the issue is that black takes on c4, bc4, and then probably comes in with the rook, and all of a sudden it's not clear whose position is really better, because my a3 pawn is super weak. Maybe I can still play bishop b2, but I don't really have much of an advantage anymore. I think black is just totally fine. So I looked for, let's say, a more ambitious move. I think I found a nice idea to pose some problems, and I decided to play this move, rook to d1. So it's a nice counter-attacking move. The point is, if black takes on a4, then I'll recapture, and in case of rook takes b2, I'm going to take on d7. Then we reach this endgame with opposite color bishops, but I think white has a huge advantage here, mainly because the rook and bishop are more active, and they're very well coordinated. They're already lined up against the f7 pawn. This bishop is hitting the a pawn. The e4 pawn is an easy target. And once I win the a pawn, I have these two a pawns to start pushing forward, and it seems very easy that white is just going to get a huge advantage here. Not to mention black just has some concrete problems, like already has to do something about the bishop. King f8 seems like the only move. Then white can consider a move like rook to a7, threatening the a pawn and also threatening to give check and winning a piece. So this just looked like a total disaster for black. So after rook d1, I felt like I again had some chances here, and black really should have played bishop takes c4. In the game, black ends up taking the knight, which I think is a definite mistake. After bishop takes c4, white should recapture. Apparently black had this cool defensive move rook b7 and is kind of just equal here. In the game, I didn't see this move. I thought black was more likely going to play knight to b6, and I wasn't sure what I would do here with white. I think I was thinking about just trading, but I do actually have this move bishop to e5, which I didn't realize. And the tactical point here is that rook b7 runs into rook to b1, and black is losing material here. Instead, black has to play like rook d8, then white can take on b6, and I believe this endgame is again good for white after like king h3, trying to come in with the king, eventually breaking with g4 or h5 to create space, and long-term playing against the c5 pawn as a major weakness here. So yeah, had this happened, maybe black might have still aired with knight b6, but I'm not sure. In any case, objectively, rook b7 here was the best defense. So rook d1, black messes up and captures the knight. B takes a4, and he doesn't take on b2 because I think he realized that endgame is very problematic, but instead plays knight to b6. But here I started feeling quite good again, because now I have the two bishops, and in particular my light square bishop I think is a really strong piece. So bishop takes a6. I think probably would have been easier to start with bishop to e5, and if black plays rook to d8 or something like this, I'll trade, take on a6, and I think this is technically just a winning endgame. The two bishops are so good. Black can take this pawn on a4, but I'll play bishop b5, I'll push the a pawn forward, and I think the two bishops kind of dominate the board. This would be very, very close to winning for white. Instead, maybe black should play rook a8 rather than rook d8 and just try to hold on to the a6 pawn. And then I was analyzing here, bishop f1, a takes a4, rook d7, and white has a big advantage. Even after bishop f6, I can trade this one off, put my bishop on c4, rook f8, take on a6, and the rook and bishop I think are really working well together, and I would definitely feel like white has nice winning chances here. Okay, in any case, I took on a6. I think this is still fine, and there is a lot more intrigue to this game, so I think I'll just get on with it. Knight takes a4, bishop e5, rook to b6. I pulled back. Now I invite black to play knight b2 so that I can trade this one off and then play rook d7 and reach a very similar endgame to what we saw before, where white can just push the a pawn very comfortably. And black has to worry about the bishop, but also the f7 pawn. So I felt like white would have a big advantage there. Instead, after bishop c4, black played bishop f6, which I feel like is an interesting try, because it kind of forces me to trade off the bishops, as knight b2 is a very annoying threat. But I was fine with the bishop trade because I knew my light squared bishop is still a really strong piece in this position. Black takes with the rook, and now I kind of go in. Rook d8 check, king h7, and rook f8. And here I felt correctly like I was winning, but I just couldn't figure it out. This game ends up being a draw, and unfortunately for me, I missed a lot of winning chances along the way, really more than I cared to count. Well, now the position really started to look really good. I mean, bishop takes f7 is coming, and then I'll be pinned, but I'll always have bishop g8 check to kind of break out of the pin. And I felt like once I take this pawn on f7, then black's position should more or less collapse. But things were not so easy. So black played knight to b2, definitely the best chance. Trying to come in with either knight to d3 or knight d1 and counterattack the f2 pawn. I took on f7 and c4. So knight d3 here, I think this would actually be very easily refuted. I can give this check and then trade rooks and pull my bishop back, and everything will be fine. White will be a pawn up, and probably just an easily winning endgame with the outside passer. But instead, black plays this move c4, which I think is a much better try, because now the c pawn potentially becomes really dangerous. And here, I just kind of lost my head. I couldn't figure out a clear way to win, and I started making mistakes and eventually blundering. So I started with bishop g8 check. Black played king h6. I pulled back, threatening mate in one move, just to repeat and actually get to the time control. King h7, and then I gave check again, king h6. And here I made move 40, so I started thinking about what to do, and yeah, kind of missed the mark. Actually, going back, rather than giving the check, what I really should have done is just play g4, which somehow I either missed or just completely underestimated. Threatening to give check, and if king h6, g5, winning the game. I think the reason is actually I was expecting black to play king to h8 in this position, after which my plan was to trade rooks and play a move like bishop d5, gaining an important tempo by hitting this pawn, and in case of f5, just starting to bring in my king to round up the c pawn. And I felt like this was winning, especially since black's king is now so far away. But against king h6, I got a little bit confused, and I didn't realize that I have this like g4, g5 resource. So I repeated once, king h7, I gave the check again, but I should have just played g4 in this position, or, from the very start, as this would take away the h6 square, and I'm also threatening just to play g5 and kick kick black's rook away completely, and then I think white just has a crushing position. But okay, so I play check, king h6, and then after a long think, I decided to trade rooks because I figured I was winning the bishop and knight endgame, which white is winning there, but things are not so easy. Instead, probably rook c8 would have been a much easier way to win the game. I was really worried about knight d3, and once you see knight d3 and rook takes f2 coming with check, you just kind of stop your calculation, and I think this is kind of lazy, and I really should have just investigated deeper. Because after bishop takes c4, I'm hitting the knight, and I'm also threatening mate on h8. So if black takes on f2 with the rook, white can play king to g1, and it resigns because rook h8 is a huge threat. I'm also threatening to just take the knight and take the rook. So this is just game over. I'm definitely capable of calculating this line, but this was really just a psychological mistake, because in my mind, I'm seeing knight d3, and my whole approach to the game at this point is to try to not allow counterplay. And knight d3 looks like counterplay, so I kind of hesitate away from this line, but concrete calculation shows that white is just winning here. So that's definitely on me not to have gone for it. And it's not even like losing the f2 pawn is so dramatic anyway if white is picking up every other pawn on the board. Well, okay, so I ended up trading rooks, and I'm still a pawn up here after king f1, and my idea is to just bring in the king as quickly as possible, try to get the c pawn under control. If he pushes c3, I want to put my bishop on b3, and then eventually I'm going to win with the outside pass pawn. I felt like winning chances are great here, especially since black has this g6 pawn that's stuck on a light square, and if the king ever gets too far, I'll just play bishop f7 and start collecting pawns. Well, this is all nice, and it almost worked out, but unfortunately my tactical antenna kind of failed me here. So black played c3, and here I had a big choice between playing king e2 or bishop b3. And honestly, I felt like both moves were winning here. After king e2, the critical line was knight d3, where black is starting to push c2, and I don't have bishop b3 because of knight c1 check. So I'm forced to play king to d1. Black takes on f2, which I psychologically didn't want to allow. But I kept going this time. I thought king c2 would happen, knight g4, king takes c3, knight takes e3. And I remember when I was calculating here, I really wanted to just play king d4 in this position. But once I saw that knight c2 check is possible, king takes e4, he takes on a3, and we just have a very easy draw. Suddenly I realized, oh no, I can't go for this. I also saw king d2 is met with knight c4 check, taking the pawn. And somehow it got in my head that I'm just losing the a-pawn, not realizing that I actually just don't have to move my king at all in this position, and I can just push a4, and black's knight is not going to be able to effectively deal with the pawn and, let's say, go after the g3 pawn either. So black is just losing here. Has to jump back to try and get back. White can keep pushing the pawn, and the knight is able to stop the pawn, but the king just comes in, e3, bishop c4, and eventually white is going to be able to round up the knight, and the knight won't even be able to give itself up for the a-pawn. White is just going to take the knight and then promote the queen and win the game. So this line was definitely a very clear win, and I felt like it was winning, but I wasn't exactly convinced, and so I ended up going with my other choice, bishop b3, which looked just safer since I just want to put my bishop on c2, put my king on e2, and then slowly advance my a-pawn, and it looks like there's no way black's knight can kind of fight against all this. But I completely forgot about the move knight to c4, which is a very nice resource, and all of a sudden saves the game for black. In fact, I'd seen this move in other variations, at least this type of trick, but somehow it eluded me in this position, and that was quite unfortunate. So of course black found this move, and now knight d2 check is threatened, as well as knight takes a3 followed by c2. I think I was lucky here not to just be completely losing and like losing a piece by force or something. But I kept my head. I realized, what, if I keep playing, maybe I can actually create some more chances here. Although, yeah, this was quite discouraging to say the least. Okay, I play king e2, knight takes a3, and g4. To me, this felt like the only move to keep any kind of hopes for a win alive. The point is that I'm trying to separate the e4 pawn from the f6 pawn, so I can play bishop d5 at some point and take the pawn on e4. And if black plays f5, as it's kind of tempting, well then I'll be able to take, g takes, and then the pawn on f5 will be a weakness my bishop can target. Objectively, black is fine here, but as it turns out, it's actually not that easy to maintain the draw. So he played knight to b1, king d1, knight d2, and bishop d5. The knight on d2 looks nice, but I am kind of threatening to just play king c2 and pick up the c pawn. So things do become quite difficult here for black, and he started spending a lot of time trying to figure out how exactly he can make a draw here. I think the main reason black has a lot of drawing chances is because now the pawns are all on one side of the board. This is where the knight kind of excels. And there are many positions where black can be a pawn down, but if the knight and king are well placed, he can create an easy fortress where white is unable to make any progress. So there are many cases where white could be a pawn up but not winning, but for the moment there are enough pawns on the board where things are still a little bit dicey here for black. So he ends up going for f5, which I think is definitely a reasonable move. Knight f3 looks very tempting, and these were some interesting lines to look at after bishop takes e4. If black takes on h4 here, white can really pose a lot of problems with f4, because now the bishop is in perfect position to dominate the knight. And if black plays f5, white plays g5 check, king h5, and the bishop moves. It's actually hard for black to get his knight out, and white is ready to play king c2, king takes c3, and just bring in the king. I analyze this one a little bit deeper, and I think black is making a draw here with the most precise play, but it's definitely an interesting position to look at. Black also had this idea, instead of knight takes h4, to play knight h2, just targeting the g-pawn, and this is what I was looking at during the game, and it seems like a pretty forcing way to make the draw. After f3, the point is black has this breakthrough with f5, which I think is kind of interesting. Now white has to trade off some pawns. Bishop can't take because black will take this pawn on f3 and then the one on h4. And if I move my bishop, black can, for example, play knight f1, e4, check, and push the pawn, king d2, and king h5. This is like a very computer type line, but it kind of shows what black is playing for. The c pawn is still a very nice distraction. This construction I think is also quite nice, just the knight defending the pawn and the pawn indirectly defending the knight. White can't advance because the bishop is hanging, and black is ready to just take the h4 pawn and eventually liquidate everything. So as we can see, these draws are not that easy to find. So even though the position looks very drawish, black still has some problems to solve here. And in the game, I actually end up getting a couple of opportunities to win, which I unfortunately pass up. So f5 was played, and I took on f5, g takes f5, and I played bishop e6 here. And here black really should have just played the simple move king to g6, just holding on to this pawn. My plan was to play king c2, then after king f6, bishop c8. I think black is just holding here with the move knight to f3. Let's say I push the pawn, black comes back, I can take on c3, and black can play a move like king to g5 and is basically just in time. White comes in, king d4, king takes h5, king e5, king g5. f5 pawn is a horrible weakness, but black is able to defend it easily, and the king can just shuffle between g6 and g5 back and forth, and white isn't able to do anything. At a certain point, black can probably also just come in and try to pick up white's pawns as well, and force the draw that way. So that was, I think, the easiest way to hold the position, but black goes for king h5, trying to liquidate the pawns off the board, and I felt like this was suspicious, but I suddenly couldn't figure out exactly how to win. It turns out that white's, the easiest way was bishop takes f5, just taking this pawn. Then after king takes h4, king c2, king to g5, I think this is where I missed the move bishop h7. The line I was trying to calculate was king takes c3, hitting the knight, I thought black would probably play knight b1 check. Then if I want to not lose a piece, I have to play, let's say, king b2. King takes f5. King takes b1. King g4. And white doesn't quite end up winning in this line. At first glance, it looks like king d4 and white gets there first, but getting there first in this kind of thing is usually not good, and black wins. So this line definitely scared me off during the game in terms of just going down this path whatsoever, and somehow I just forgot to look at the move bishop h7, and white just keeps the attack on the e4 pawn, keeps the attack on the c3 pawn. If black moves the knight, he's just going to lose both pawns after king takes c3 and then bishop takes c4. And yeah, I checked this position pretty carefully with the engine. White is completely winning here. Black has no drawing chances of, let's say, trying to sacrifice the knight for the 2 pawns. White should just slowly bring in his king, advance his pawns, keep them on dark squares so that black can never blockade, and the extra pawns win easily. The key line I would probably have to see is that after king h6 here, now I can take on c3, because in the same line, black's king ends up farther. So king b2, if black takes here, then I take the knight. I go for the same king and pawn endgame where white is ahead by a lot of tempi. Let's say I can play here, king f3, and then king move, and black is forced to give up the pawn and lose the game. So that was the first miss, unfortunately. In the game after bishop e6, king h5, I played king c2 first. And here he realized that things went wrong. So now after king takes h4, I can play bishop takes f5. And white is again actually winning both pawns and probably winning the game. So instead, black played this move f4, which was an excellent practical try, because at this point he realized things are going wrong and he has to do something about white getting 2 connected passers. So the point is now after e takes f4, white will eventually end up with 2 extra pawns, but they'll be doubled f pawns and very hard to win with. So that's what we ended up getting. King takes h4. Actually, I think this move was inaccurate. Knight f3 here. Getting the knight back as quickly as possible was actually necessary. Let's say king takes c3, king to g6. Then he'll take with the knight on h4, put the king on f6, bring the knight back to g6, and that will be a very easily drawn position. But black played king takes h4, which looks extremely natural, just grabbing the pawn. King takes c3. And honestly, at this point, I had kind of given up on the game. Not fully, I was still calculating quite a bit, just looking for chances, but psychologically, it was tough to really continue with maximum effort here, because I knew that I had blown much bigger advantage earlier and most likely winning. But I kept fighting because I felt like maybe there were still some chances to win the game, and those intuitions were correct. I just unfortunately couldn't capitalize on them. Black played knight to f3 here, and after a little bit of thought, I played the move king to c4, which to me just looked like the only real winning try. The point is to play king to d5 and either take the e4 pawn or try to sneak into e6 and maybe even run my pawn up if black's king is not back in time. Black played king h5, king d5, king g6, king takes e4, and this position ended up just being a pretty trivial draw for black. The problem for me is that black's king can just sit on a dark square. I can never displace it, and the knight is able to jump around through enough squares where it's not able to get trapped, and it can eventually either force a repetition or reach home base, after which white is just has 0 chances to win with the doubled pawns. So I tried for a little bit here, knight d2 check, king e3. Black could have still gone wrong here, for example, with knight f1, king e2, knight h2, f3. Here the knight is actually just getting trapped, and after white picks it up, the game is just over. This is one of the, I think, best benefits of having 2 extra pawns rather than 1, is that sometimes double pawns don't look like they're that useful, but when you have 2 pawns rather than 1, your opponent can't give up a piece for your final pawn, right? So you can still win with that last pawn, and it's kind of an important detail. But instead, black played knight b1, which looks like the knight is almost getting trapped, but he is able to just kind of get out here through the a3, b5 squares. And then once the knight reaches black side of the board, white just has no chances. So I tried bishop c4, knight c3, king d4, just trying to keep the knight at bay. But at this point, I think almost any move draws for black. He chose knight d1, bishop d3 check, king f6, f3, knight f2, king e3, knight d1 back, and white just has, again, no way of trapping the knight. So I tried a little bit longer. Eventually, we got a pretty nice line, knight to b2, bishop b5. Here it looks like I'm finally trapping the knight as I've gotten the domination, but of course black's king is able to come in just in time and take both of my pawns. And this is how the game ended and was a draw. So going back to the final critical moment back here, after king takes c3, knight f3, this was the last moment where I actually missed a chance to win. And I only discovered this after the game, looking at it with the engine. I'm not sure I would have ever found it, even just analyzing on my own. But the move was bishop f5. And the point is I want to take the pawn with the bishop and actually attack the knight before the knight is able to figure out where it's going. And I just didn't realize this during the game, but the bishop on e4 is actually going to be extremely well placed, because whether the knight goes to e1 or h4, it ends up being dominated on the side of the board. So this was really a nice idea. And again, if the black knight goes to h2, white will push the pawn to f3, and black's knight will be kind of stuck there as well. So yeah, this was a really nice winning idea. I feel like black's only move here would be king to h5, bishop takes e4, and I analyzed some lines here. For example, knight to g1, trying to come out via the h3 square. White comes in, king d3, knight h3, bishop f3 check, king g6, and king e3. White is kind of just in time, and the knight on h3 ends up stuck. White's plan is to play bishop g4, and after knight g1, f3, the knight will be cut off and lost. I think black has some other tries as well. Let's say knight h2 here. White can play king d4, king h6, bishop f5, king e3, and the knight is again slowly round up, and game over. So yeah, I mean, maybe if I considered this move during the game, I would have realized its strength, but to me, king c4 was kind of the only move that was really making sense, just trying to bring in the king as quickly as possible. And yeah, I just didn't really look for this one. If I got this position as like a endgame problem and was told like white to play and win, then I might be able to figure it out. But it's one of those things when you're at the board, you kind of feel like the game is drawn no matter what. So best chance seems to be just like bringing the king in. But yeah, this was a really nice one. I mean, a very instructive win, and very fascinating how the knight can sit on f3 and just end up being eventually trapped. Okay, so unfortunately I couldn't win this one, but at least I was able to stop the bleeding after those 3 losses. At this point in the tournament, I had 1.5 out of 5 with 4 games to go. So thanks a lot for watching, and make sure to subscribe, and I'll see you in the next videos. Take care.